In wartime, we expect aggression, but these days,
the pretense even of having a rules-bound liberal order is gone.
How the language of war affects a war itself. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Also today, the IOC announces it's banning transgender women from women's sports in the Olympics.
The scientific evidence is very clear. Male chromosomes give performance advantages in sports that rely on strength, power, or endurance.
Trans advocates say it's an attempt to marginalize a whole community.
Sporting prowess and sporting abilities depend on a range of factors. Could be physiological, but also depends just as much on your training, on your diet, on nutrition.
Also, why Ukraine has ramped up its use of renewable energy.
Those stories in a moment of Zen from Easter Island, today on The World.
This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Thank you for being here. Transgender women will be banned from competing in women's sports at the Olympics. That announcement today from the International Olympic Committee takes effect at the 2028 Games in Los Angeles. As part of that ruling, all athletes competing in women's events at future Olympics will have to undergo a sex screening test.
This has been a hugely contentious subject in global sports. We start things off today with the World's Europe correspondent, Orla Berry.
Yeah, it's probably the most significant decision that the IOC president, Kirsty Coventry, has taken since she was elected. She's the first female president of the International Olympic Committee, and she said today it's a decision that was taken with the best interest of athletes at heart. A review was conducted over the last 18 months, and she said it was clear that this is the way forward.
The scientific evidence is very clear. Male chromosomes give performance advantages in sports that rely on strength, power, or endurance. At the Olympic Games, even the smallest margins can be the difference between victory and defeat. So it's absolutely clear that it would not be fair for biological males to compete in the female category.
So this is all going to be based on a genetic test that athletes will have to undergo before participating in the Olympics. Can you tell me what that test is, how it'll work?
What they will do is they'll test for the S or Y gene, and that's a gene that's located on the Y chromosome that initiates male sex determination. Essentially, it's supposed to detect the biological sex. Now, our understanding is that the test will be non-intrusive. It may be a saliva test or a cheek swab or maybe a blood sample. And once an athlete tests negative, that they'll then be considered eligible for the women's category. But the IOC itself has long opposed mandatory sex testing because it deemed that it violated athletes' rights in the past. And it was a test that was used back in the 1980s, but abolished in the 1990s because they said there were too many false positives at the time. In fact, the professor, Dr. Andrew Sinclair, who first found this gene, this SRY gene, has himself come out to say this is the wrong way to determine biological sex. He says biological sex is much more complex. There's chromosomal, there's hormonal, there's secondary sex characteristics. They all play a role. And he said this is too simplistic. So you can imagine that this is going to lead to a lot more debate over the coming months.
Yeah. And one of the complexities there is that this ban will not just impact transgender women. It will also affect people with what are called differences in sexual development. Can you explain what that means?
That's right, DSD. The first time, by the way, a transgender woman competed at an Olympics after transitioning was only in 2021. What we have seen most frequently is athletes with a DSD, with this difference in sexual development, competing. And this is a condition in which someone's hormones, their genes, or their reproductive organs can be a sort of a mix of male and female characteristics. So they would, for example, have reported female at birth, but they might have male chromosomes or male testosterone levels. And of course, the most famous example is Caster Semenya from South Africa, the two-time Olympic women's 800-metre champion, whom we spoke to on the show here not so long ago. And her DSD means that she has male XY chromosomes. And essentially, the ruling today indicates that it would mean she would be barred. Someone in her position would be barred.
Orla, this issue of trans kids and adults in sports has become highly politicized, at least here in the U.S. How has that played into this decision about the Olympics, this international sporting event?
In fact, today, after the announcement was made, we saw the White House Press Secretary, Caroline Leavitt, crediting President Trump for the change. She posted on X saying that President Trump's executive order protecting women's sports made this happen. You remember he signed this executive order banning trans athletes from women's college sports last year. And this is a topic that we've constantly seen playing out in the political sphere. But I spoke to Deekshita Ganesan today. She's with Transgender Europe, and it's an advocacy group in Berlin that works to promote the rights of transgender people. And I asked Deekshita how it feels for her organisation and people that work with transgender people to see this topic being raised again today and to see the ban being introduced.
This is now one in a series of measures that are being taken to exclude trans people from participation in public life in all forms. Is going to further push trans people into the margins of society. It's taken a long time to advocate for their rights and to get where we've come so far. And these different measures are chipping away at these sort of hard-fought victories. And yeah, it is deeply concerning.
The world's Orla Berry, thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Ousted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro is fighting charges against him in the U.S. He and his wife appeared in federal court today in Manhattan. This was their second appearance since being picked up in a U.S. military raid in January. The U.S. Justice Department's charges against Maduro include drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. It is exceptionally rare for the U.S. to prosecute a sitting or former foreign head of state. Jeff Ramsey is a fellow at the Atlantic Council and an analyst specializing on threats in Central and Latin America. I spoke to him about the case today, and he started with Maduro's legal defense.
Maduro and his legal team are expected to claim that Maduro is immune to prosecution as a head of state. The U.S. denies that, however. The U.S. has not viewed Maduro as the legitimate head of Venezuela since 2019, actually, when they recognized an opposition politician as the legitimate head of the Venezuelan government. That is changing, though. The U.S. has now renewed diplomatic relations with Venezuela and recognizes Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, as the country's leader. So there are some really complicated diplomatic nuances that I expect will be on display in this trial.
Yeah, so on the side of the prosecution then, how strong of a case does the U.S. government have?
I mean, I think the U.S. is going to make clear that, regardless of, how Maduro may view himself, the executive branch has the authority to determine who its counterparts are in engaging with heads of state. And so I think that's going to be a central argument here for the prosecution, that Maduro is not a head of state, that he's not the president of Venezuela, and that, in fact, this was a years-long narco-terrorism plot.
What potential pitfalls do you see on either side of this case?
I think the truth is that on Maduro's side, this initial hearing is about whether the Venezuelan government can pay his legal bills. The reality is, I think we have to assume that the current Venezuelan government, led by his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, appears to have very little interest in associating itself too closely with him. The Rodriguez administration in Venezuela has been very successful in normalizing relations with the United States and attracting promises of U.S. investment in the oil sector. So, I have to think that if you're Delcy Rodriguez, you're looking at this trial and you're wanting to maintain an arm's length from it.
Is that ignoring the fact, though, that relations with Venezuela may have been normalized by force? That if Rodriguez didn't move away from Maduro, she might have been ousted too?
I think that's certainly true, and I think, Rodriguez herself has talked about these very tense minutes and hours after Maduro's capture, in which she allegedly received a message from the U.S. government, essentially warning her that she could be next if she did not play along. Having said that, though, I think the reality is that the U.S. opted to work with Delcy Rodriguez because they understand that you can't simply flip a switch and change a country overnight. You have to work with at least some elements of the regime to ensure stability, even as you work for an eventual transition.
Now, we should recall that President Trump pardoned the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who had been convicted in New York 2 years ago for conspiring to import over 400 tons of cocaine into the U.S. Other than that, prosecutions of a head of state are exceptionally rare, as I said earlier. Are these, though, generally drug cases? I mean, is there a particular standard that's used?
So, I'm not aware of the jurisprudence on this issue, but, I think we have to say that the war on drugs has been a central issue in U.S. Latin America relations. And it's not surprising that the U.S. geopolitical aims in the region have overlapped with the U.S. fight against drug trafficking organizations in ways that, have played out in the courtroom against former heads of state.
So Maduro's trial is happening in New York. Take us to what you're seeing in Venezuela right now and what the current situation there is like today.
Sure. So I think it's fair to say that Venezuelans are excited at the prospect of political change in the country. Maduro himself was deeply unpopular. Maduro lost an election overwhelmingly to the opposition candidate in 2024, but clung to power anyway and essentially stole that vote. And so I think for many Venezuelans, this trial is the first taste of accountability that they've had against a dictator who has ruled the country for over a decade. Having said that, I think Venezuelans are apprehensive at the evolving relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela and seeking more clarity about where this process is going to lead and some kind of a guarantee that this will eventually lead to a more democratic and prosperous Venezuela.
So you said earlier that Delcy Rodriguez has not shown much interest in coming to Maduro's legal rescue, but has Venezuela's sitting government taken any kind of official stance on Maduro's prosecution?
Officially, the position of the Venezuelan government is that Maduro remains the president of Venezuela. Delcy Rodriguez herself presents herself as the interim president of Venezuela or the acting president of Venezuela. The official position of the Venezuelan government is that, of course, they should cover Maduro's legal fees and defense because he is, after all, according to them, still the head of state. However, I think we have to assume, just given how closely Delcy Rodriguez and her administration is working with Washington, that there's a bit of a gap between rhetoric and reality here. Ultimately, Delcy Rodriguez has a vested interest in proving to Washington that she can work well with the Trump administration and advance U.S. interests.
Does it seem to you like Venezuela is, in a way, moving on?
I think Venezuela is moving on from Maduro. Having said that, I think the direction that it's moving in is still relatively unclear. I think the fact that Secretary of State Marco Rubio and so many others in the Trump administration are being explicit in saying that a democratic transition is the end goal here is very positive. Having said that, exactly how we get from the status quo today in which Washington and Caracas are working closely together on oil deals and talking about investment. How we go from there to a free and fair election where Venezuelans' fundamental rights are restored, I think that still needs to be sketched out.
This is not an open and shut case. What happens if the U.S. loses?
Well, I think that's a high stakes issue for this administration, especially just given how the president views Venezuela as a fundamental success story. And so, I think we can expect this administration to be watching this case very closely, and for the U.S. Department of Justice to pull no punches here to ensure that Maduro ends up convicted.
Jeff Ramsey is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. After more than a decade of war and economic collapse, many people in Yemen thought their country was starting to turn a corner. The onset of some stability a few years ago offered a little hope that the economy would come back to life. That's when the online trouble began. Trading platforms pitched themselves as part of that recovery. These sites turned out to be scams. They targeted women who wanted to help their families get out of poverty. One company, after just a week online, vanished with $12 million from some 40,000 investors. From the capital Sana'a, reporters Hashed Mozaker and Bassem Al-Nawawi spoke with victims about how these scams spread and how they exploited people desperate for income.
Shuruq Hamati is a 27-year-old from Sana'a. She says she cares deeply about saving money and believes in the old Arabic saying, القرش الأبيض ينفع في اليوم الأسود, which roughly translates to, save your white penny for a black day. Sitting in her home, she says that about a year and a half ago, she decided to sell gold that she had been collecting for 9 years. It was worth about $7,000 at the time.
يعني الأيام وقتها سمعت عن منصة AITS تقريبا.
She says everyone was talking about the AITS platform in WhatsApp groups. Even some of her friends, they all told her that it was the opportunity of a lifetime and the profits could reach more than 20% within weeks. Hamati kept investing in the platform. She says she thought, why should the gold just sit in the closet when she could sell it and multiply her income?
رحت بنك الكريمي أحول الفلوس. كانت هناك بنت تستلم حوالة.
Hamati says when she went to the bank to transfer the money, a teller there asked her what she was doing. When she explained, a girl in the line overheard her and tried to warn her and urged her to keep her money. In August, however, the platform disappeared and her savings were gone. Her gold, which she had sold, had almost doubled in value. This was not the first time a platform in Yemen has scammed millions.
اللي قهرني إني ما كنت محتاجة أقامر. كنت أمتلك ذهب محفوظ.
She says what kills her is that she didn't need to take the risk, but greed made her lose everything. Now, every time she sees an advertisement about gold prices, her heart breaks. She hopes that no other woman ever goes through it. These platforms often target women through WhatsApp groups, using representatives trained to recruit one woman in each neighborhood by convincing her that she will earn a commission for every new contributor she brings in, according to Yemeni economic expert Ali Al-Tuwaiti.
التوعية والنشر عن هذه المنصات الوهمية لكن آلية هذه المنصات وضعت بدقة تجعل
Al-Tuwaiti says that despite awareness campaigns about these fake platforms, the schemes are carefully designed to make some victims promote them by enticements. After receiving initial profits, large commissions are offered for those who bring others in, so they promote it to earn more. And of course, since they received their initial profits, they convince others that it actually is profitable.
يصدقون ذلك ويدخلون معه فيدخل الكثير وكل واحد يدخل.
People believe this and join, so many enter, and each one brings in dozens with them, Al-Tuwaiti says. So the circle grows, and disaster strikes after the platform closes. This is what happened to Yemeni victims through these platforms. Yemen is the world's third most remittance-dependent country, receiving approximately $7.4 billion annually, which accounts for about 38% of its GDP. According to The Economist, this has made it a prime target for these types of platforms.
تخدم التسويق الهرمي وكيف تقري الضحية.
Al-Tuwaiti adds that victims often get their money from savings set aside for hard times, a common practice among the Yemeni people. Most of the women either borrow funds, take money from relatives, or sell their gold to invest in these pyramid schemes. Many representatives only discover after the platforms shut down that they were tricked into recruiting other victims, relatives, friends, and acquaintances, creating widespread financial harm. This is what happened to housewife Siham Hamid, 30, who invested her family's life savings in the scheme. Her husband has been working for years in Saudi Arabia, and she was careful with the money he sent her, cutting down on expenses to secure her daughter's future.
قدرت أن أنا أجمع $25,000 قبل عدة أشهر. اقترحت علي
The mother of 3 daughters, who can be heard playing in the background, says that after years of saving, she managed to collect $25,000, an enormous sum here. A few months ago, her cousin suggested she join an investment platform called AITS. Her cousin told her that it was very profitable, with a system called golden shares, and that people could earn incredible profits within just 2 weeks. Her cousin had invested before her and was receiving monthly profits without any problems. She did not suspect that she was setting her up because they were family. Without any hesitation, she paid the full amount.
قلت لنفسي خلاص هذا فرصتي إن أنا أحقق شيء لبناتي أشتري بيت أو أفتح
She
مشروع.
says that she convinced herself that this is her chance to secure something for my daughters, to buy a house or start a business. But exactly 2 weeks later, around August 10th, the platform disappeared. There was no website, no replies, and no one knew who was behind it. All the money was gone. In one stroke, she had lost a dream that seemed to be almost in the palm of her hand.
لما عرف زوجي بالموضوع ما تقبل أبدا اللي صار.
When Siham told her husband, he couldn't accept what had happened. He was furious, accused her of acting foolishly and without his knowledge. And a few days later, he divorced her. Now she lives with her parents, without money, enduring pitiful looks from those around her, she says. A Sana'a official, who requested anonymity because he is not authorized to speak to foreign media, told us that most of the complaints he receives regarding AITS come from women. According to the source, there's nothing much officials can do when women come forward to report these platforms, since by the time the investigation officially begins, the platform has often already disappeared, along with thousands of riyals from those who trusted it. He adds that most of these platforms are based outside Yemen, leaving the authorities with limited options when trying to pursue legal action against the perpetrators. He adds that the consequences extend to serious social and family problems. Some of these losses have caused families to break apart, leading to divorces and disputes between spouses, especially when the family discovers that savings were lost in an illegitimate investment. Lawyer Abdullah Al-Hakim explains that law enforcement and judicial authorities need to do more to investigate immediately upon receiving a report and to forward the case to the public prosecutor so that the perpetrators can be held accountable. Many of these fraudulent companies are incorporated in countries where they can't be caught, he says. He points out that this kind of thing happens all over the world, but it's especially bad in developing countries like Yemen, where people are desperate to escape the poverty brought on by a decade of devastating civil war.
Hashed Mozaka reported from Egypt and Bassem Al-Nawawi from Sana'a, Yemen. Just ahead, it's not just the war in Iran heating up. Leaders' rhetoric about war is also escalating. That conversation is next. You're listening to The World.
This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. Wars are waged on multiple fronts. There's the obvious one, the fight for control on the battlefield, but that is always accompanied by a war of words. And in the U.S., the way leaders are talking about war has changed, becoming increasingly violent and vengeful. That is especially true for President Donald Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
Operation Epic Fury. I love that name.
No stupid rules of engagement, no nation-building quagmire, no democracy-building exercise.
We're going to end up with settling this. Otherwise, we'll just keep bombing our little hearts out.
Gone, seemingly, are the days when U.S. intervention abroad was carefully messaged as serving a greater moral purpose, as in George W. Bush's announcement of the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
We wanted to look more closely at that shift in rhetoric and what its impacts are around the globe with George Soroka. He teaches a course in politics and propaganda at Harvard University. He told me he is struck by just how aggressive current rhetoric has become.
Obviously, it's a time of war. We expect aggression, but The pretense even of having a rules-bound liberal order is gone. It's pretty clear that they're not interested in even selling to the public this idea of building democracy or getting rid of a dictatorship. It's really about expressing raw power.
And I'm curious, when you listen to that George Bush clip that we played, the tone is obviously different. As you are saying, it is selling peace and democracy. Do you find that meaningful beyond a difference in rhetorical style?
I do find that meaningful. At the core of it, I mean, the intent may have been the same in both instances. We don't know what happens in leaders' hearts. But I think it is meaningful because it sets the discursive frame for the narrative. It sets the reporting that follows on this. It sets the tone for the commentary that pundits follow on this. And you can imagine the polarizing influence of the George Bush clip is not as great as that of the Donald Trump clip.
I want to come back to more examples in a second, but what you just said begs the question, does the way we talk about war actually change what happens to people on the ground, right? At its most impactful, we're talking about people being killed. So does how we talk about that change the facts on the ground?
Well, I think that's still an open question. You know, that's a question scholars are grappling with. I think how we frame the narrative around a war, how we frame the enemy, really is pretty meaningful. It has to do with vilifying the enemy and thinking about this person as someone who I disagree with. I might even disagree to the point of wanting to kill them, versus someone who is just entirely irredeemably evil or bad. And the words that are being used are not being couched anymore. I mean, the old liberal order, this pretense of a rule-governed world, or at least the kind of longing for a world governed by rules and institutions and laws, has really been done away with. But absolutely, I think leaders play a role, and I think that reflects how people think about this all the way down to the military chain of command.
This is not just talk about Iran. President Trump also said he could have the honor of taking Cuba. I was struck by that language. And White House official Stephen Miller in January was on CNN's State of the Union, and Jake Tapper asked him why it was okay for the U.S. to grab Venezuela President Nicolás Maduro. And here's what he said.
We live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world that have existed since the beginning of time.
What do you hear there?
Honestly, I hear Thucydides 2,500 years ago when he wrote that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. I'm seeing a very realist politics. I'm also seeing a very imperial language. It's not we will, it's I will take. This idea that America can do what it wants. So there's this interesting mix of a very transactional side to this. Venezuelan oil will pay for this. But there's also a really symbolic component of this. There's a longing for nostalgia. We're making America great again. The Gulf of America, the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico. So I guess what is old is new again.
We do have leaders in other parts of the world using a similarly bellicose rhetoric. It has been central to what China has called wolf warrior diplomacy. Here is a broadcaster on Sky News in Australia describing a sharp diplomatic flare-up in late 2025 between Beijing and Tokyo, centered on comments by Japan's prime minister about Taiwan.
And when Japan's new prime minister said, well, actually, Japan could defend Taiwan if it was invaded, Chinese diplomats threatened to cut her dirty neck and to break Japanese heads.
Very graphic there. Do you see that rhetoric as being influenced at all by what we are hearing coming out of the White House? Or is this a totally separate thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not occurring in a vacuum. The rhetoric has become very zero-sum. Meaning everything is seen in black and white, or at least portrayed outwardly in black and white. And in some ways that makes sense, because right now in an era of social media, sound bites are king. It's easy to vilify your enemy with a trite quote without really getting into the nuance or the complexity of a situation. I was just at a talk the other day where the discussion turned to how JFK and Khrushchev dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis. They actually exchanged letters to one another. And the idea is that they exchanged letters because that gave them time to reflect and to be nuanced. One of Khrushchev's letters, well, imagine this, in basically a week-long span of time that was so rife with potential for nuclear war, Khrushchev took the time to dictate a 6-page letter. And he gets into all sorts of nuances and pleasantries. We don't have that anymore. We have a very reactive political style. We have a political style where anybody who doesn't agree with you is instantly vilified on social media. So absolutely, it's not occurring in a vacuum. People are taking cues from the United States, from the Trump administration. But I think by the same token, Trump is also taking cues from other world leaders, in particular Vladimir Putin of Russia.
Khrushchev, of course, being the head of the Soviet Union at the time, who was trading those letters with JFK.
Yep.
So would you argue that this change in language is more a product of the change in medium and less an actual change in underlying policy?
My own take on this, for what it's worth, is that I think it's the message that the world leaders we have in power right now are wanting to put out. And this message is being abetted by social media. It's being amplified by social media. It's being amplified by a 24/7 news cycle. But I think ultimately the message resides with the leaders.
Talk to me more about Putin. I have not studied his language during his tenure in power, but I would guess that it has been forceful for a long time.
It's been very forceful for a long time, and he actually speaks very much like Trump does. The rhetorical style is very similar. I mean, he's more polished than Trump is, but the kind of tropes he uses, the kind of memes he uses, the kind of politics both of nostalgia and politics of grievance, they're very similar. You know, he came to power when the Second Chechen War was breaking out. He had this famous clip where he talked about how he was going to wipe out the Chechens in the outhouse. He didn't use the term outhouse. He used a little cruder term. But that went over like gangbusters. I mean, that solidified his popularity. You know, this is a tough guy after all of these ineffective leaders or effete leaders. Finally, we have a real man in power. And I think that has very profound similarities to Trump's appeal to at least part of the American public.
I want to get your thoughts on something that happened today. This morning, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth delivered a prayer for the U.S. Armed Forces from the Pentagon. It is expected to be the first of a regular monthly prayer. And the rhetoric in this prayer was notable.
Grant this task force clear and righteous targets for violence. Surround them as a shield. Protect the innocent and blameless in their midst. Make their arrows like those of a skilled warrior who returned not empty-handed. Let every round find its mark against the enemies of righteousness and our great nation. Give them wisdom in every decision, endurance for the trial ahead, unbreakable unity, and overwhelming violence of action against those who deserve no mercy.
Overwhelming violent action against those who deserve no mercy. So we just heard a U.S. official saying America's targets in combat do not deserve mercy. Do you hear that as a departure?
I hear that very much as a departure because I'm thinking back as he was talking. I was thinking back to the first Iraq war and basically U.S. troops being called off on the march to Baghdad because it was viewed as just being a slaughter, and it was viewed as beneath the U.S. military to continue with such asymmetric power, essentially shooting fish in a barrel, as it were.
We actually have a clip of President Bush sending troops into Iraq in 2003 where he calls for saving as many civilians as possible.
I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm.
That was when he was announcing the incursion.
It's pretty amazing. And now we have an administration that is not even apologizing for what looks to be the accidental bombing of that school in Iran where all those school children died. I think it's a pretty profound departure. And also this mixture of the religious element into this, because it almost gives it kind of a prophetic quality. from the U.S. side, we've always had in this country this strand of what used to be called muscular Christianity, this idea that Christians aren't just meek and turn the other cheek, but they could also be robust and manly and so forth. And that's really been leaned into by a lot of people in power today. But it's not only happening here. This is happening in Hungary with Viktor Orban saying his country should be white and Christian, even though actual levels of Christianity are pretty low in Hungary today. It's certainly happening with Russia and the way the Russian Orthodox Church has been appropriated to serve the Kremlin's mission in Ukraine. I mean, there's no other way to put it, I think. When the patriarch comes out and says people who fight in the war and die will be absolved of their sins.
George, the U.S. audience is not the only audience for the type of language that we were hearing coming out of the White House. How does this kind of language land with people outside of the U.S. who might be hearing it?
Well, I think it depends who you are and where you are and how you situate yourself politically. I even know a lot of Iranians or people in the Iranian diaspora. In fact, I was talking to someone that fits that bill just last week who are really happy with this language because they hate the regime. You know, and this is not at all to sugarcoat what that regime is like. I mean, it's a horrific regime. We've heard about the massacre of protesters numbering into tens of thousands. I mean, absolutely horrific. So it depends, I mean, would be my answer. But for many people, let's say in Western Europe that had been accustomed to this more liberal world order, to a more progressive type of politics, this is all landing like a ton of bricks. I mean, a lot of people have just lost their bearings, including politicians. They don't quite know what to make of it.
George Soroka is a lecturer in the government department at Harvard University. Thank you so much for sharing your take on this.
Thank you very much.
A historic decision has come out of the United Nations General Assembly, a resolution to officially recognize the transatlantic slave trade from the 1500s through the 1800s as, quote, the gravest crime against humanity. That passed yesterday. Ghana proposed the resolution, which also encourages nations to apologize for the slave trade, set aside funds for reparations, and to address ongoing racism and discrimination.
123 countries voted for the resolution. Only Argentina, Israel, and the United States voted against it. A U.S. representative to the UN said while the U.S. condemns slavery, it does not recognize a legal right to reparations for past wrongs that were not illegal when committed. It is clear how big of an impact the war with Iran is having on global energy markets. This is not entirely without precedent. Something similar happened when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine 4 years ago.
The assault on Ukraine's energy infrastructure has not stopped, so its government has been trying to get more energy from renewable sources, less vulnerable to attacks. The Ukrainian people seem to have embraced the move for their own security. That's what we're looking at this week on The Big Fix, where we hear about the most ambitious efforts to tackle the climate crisis.
Konstantin Krynitsky is based in Kyiv, where he works for the Ukrainian NGO EcoAction. He joined me to explain the country's buy-in for the switch to renewable energy.
Basically, when Russia attacks our energy infrastructure, they destroy our power plants, coal power plants, heat supply. We need to create a more robust and more resilient and decentralized system. So for us, for Ukraine, it became the question basically of survival. And renewables are the way because they're cheaper and they're quicker to install. And we see this kind of support going from the government, yes, but the bulk of the initiative comes from local communities. So from specific cities, specific towns, they install solar panels, heat pumps, battery storage, basically for self-consumption. So they are going to those solutions that can help right now and not like far in the future.
Right. So this goal that environmental NGOs have been pushing for decades for environmental reasons has now been widely adopted both by the government and individuals because they can see a real tangible benefit, trying to have electricity when central power plants have been bombed.
Yeah, I would say that we are still working on the issues of climate, but we don't only paint it through the lenses of like CO2 emissions, but through the lenses of energy security and energy resilience. And that actually like works better now. But in parallel, when you install the renewables and boost energy efficiency measures on the local level, because of security, you're also kind of reaching the climate goals.
When I was in Ukraine a couple of years ago, I went to a school that had installed solar panels on the roof, and then they had a battery bank in the basement. And so it was one of the only places with power when the strikes, when Russian strikes sent the grid down in that area. One of the core pieces of this is that this is decentralized renewables. Tell me why that is important. So rooftop solar panels instead of big solar farms, for example.
So basically, when we are talking about centralized systems, they are very easy to destroy. Ukrainian energy system as a whole is a very like old one, a Soviet one. So we have big nuclear, we have big coal power plants, and they are very much centralized in a way that you see on the map a big coal power plant. You know where it's situated. So it's easier to destroy it. So our like ambition and our communication was also like, look, we still need some like big capacities, but also for communities, you can go smaller because in times of war, when Russia attacks our energy infrastructure, it's super hard to destroy every like small thing. They wouldn't have the necessary like missiles and capacities to do that.
And how much renewable generating capacity has been installed since the beginning of the full-scale invasion?
Oh, that's a great question, because actually currently we don't have the full numbers. We were talking with Ukrainian Association of Solar Energy, and they told us something close to 3 gigawatts of solar was installed since 2022. But the main problem why we don't have the information is because all these small capacities for schools, for hospitals, for kindergartens, for water utilities, they're installed for self-consumption, and you don't really, like the government cannot track the capacities.
Harder to track the rooftop solar, for example. But if we do think about that 3 gigawatt estimate, how significant is that as a percentage of Ukraine's energy system?
I would say it's quite significant. For example, when we talk about big nuclear, have power plants, and one nuclear unit is more or less 1 gigawatt.
Okay.
So 3 gigawatts equal like 3 power units of nuclear. So it's not a lot, but it actually alleviates and helps the energy system, especially now. It's March. It's very sunny in Kyiv now. So it really helps to stabilize our energy system, because today I don't have electricity cutoffs. And our government communicates that's because of a sunny weather and the solar that is currently in operation.
You compared this to nuclear power plants. The Ukrainian government is also looking at investing in more nuclear power as well to shore up its energy system. Is that right?
It's right, and for me, it's super crazy. Like it's so. You can imagine that Ukraine already had like Chernobyl in 1986. Basically, the environmental movement in Ukraine was born because of Chernobyl and because of. So for us, it always was about the nuclear safety and then the waste. But now, because of the war, like you need to understand that big nuclear it's a centralized system. So when you talk about building new nuclear, you talk about centralizing the energy system even more. And Russians, they don't even need to destroy like a nuclear unit. They actually can target, and they do target, the substations. The nuclear can still operate, but the electricity doesn't come to the Ukrainian communities. And
and it sounds like the environmental movement in Ukraine does not like this aspect of the Ukrainian government's plan, but it is nonetheless part of the Ukrainian government's plan.
We criticize it pretty much, yes.
So on the flip side from this increased solar installation, the war has also slowed down Ukraine's planned phase-out of coal. Is that right?
That's debatable, actually. It's still in place, but because of the Russian attacks, it was put into question. The war actually accelerates the process of the coal phase-out, because we have now many coal power plants destroyed. And it's super expensive to reconstruct them from scratch. The European Union won't finance it because of the environmental regulations. Other countries, I'm also doubtful.
Obviously, nobody in Ukraine wants this war or would have wished for this war. But now that it is here, on balance, do you think that it will help Ukraine speed up its transition to renewable energy?
I think yes. I think 100% yes, because I think there are not many other options. Wars, they speed up historical processes. And I think for Ukraine, it really speeds up the energy transition to a more decentralized system that is based more on renewables.
That was Konstantin Krenitsky. He heads up the energy department at the Ukrainian NGO Eco Action.
The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. Join us right back here tomorrow.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. LuminaFoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Judy Piggott, the Gruber Family Foundation, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and Gavin Salmonese, LLC. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.